Michael Astor tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched as the snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. What was supposed to be a quick business trip to Colorado had turned into a logistical nightmare. The private jet had been grounded due to the storm, and now his car was struggling against the relentless wind and icy roads. His phone had lost service miles ago, and the GPS was useless. The billionaire CEO of Astor Enterprises, used to controlling every aspect of his life, was now at the mercy of a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere. And then, just as he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road, bundled in a thick coat, waving frantically. Michael braked hard, tires skidding slightly on the icy road before coming to a stop. The woman rushed toward the car, her breath visible in the freezing air. He quickly pushed open the passenger door. "Get in," he barked. The woman didn't hesitate. She climbed in, shivering, her gloved hands rubbing against her arms. As soon as she pulled down her hood, he took in her features: messy, dark curls, wide brown eyes, and a face flushed from the cold. Despite the dire circumstances, she was striking. "Thank you," she breathed, her teeth chattering. "My car broke down miles back. I was starting to think I'd freeze out there." Michael exhaled sharply, glancing at the road ahead. The visibility was getting worse by the second. "You picked a hell of a time to be stranded." "Trust me, I didn't plan this," she muttered, still trembling. She hesitated before shaking her head. "Never mind, I just appreciate the ride." Michael didn't press. He wasn't in the habit of picking up strangers, but he wasn't heartless. "I'm Michael," he offered, shifting the heat up. "Oriana." "Oriana Owens," she replied, rubbing her hands together. Michael's eyes flicked to her briefly. The name suited her. The car rumbled forward through the storm, but within minutes it became clear they weren't going to make it far. The road ahead was completely buried in snow, the wind howling like a beast. Michael swore under his breath. "We're not going anywhere in this," he muttered. Oriana swallowed hard, looking around. "So, what do we do?" Michael scanned the surroundings and then spotted a faint glow in the distance. A cabin. "There," he pointed. "We waited out." They trudged through knee-deep snow, Michael leading the way as the wind fought against them. By the time they reached the door, both were shaking from the cold. Michael kicked it open, relieved to find the place stocked with firewood and basic supplies. "Looks like someone uses it occasionally," Oriana noted, glancing around. Michael wasted no time stacking logs in the fireplace, striking a match. Within minutes, warmth spread through the room, the fire crackling. Oriana sighed in relief, sinking onto the fur-covered couch. Michael shrugged off his heavy coat, shaking snow from his dark hair. Oriana watched him, her gaze flicking to the tailored suit beneath. "You don't exactly look like the kind of guy who drives through blizzards," she observed. Michael gave a short laugh. "Trust me, I don't make a habit of it." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You sound important." Michael didn't answer right away. He was used to people knowing exactly who he was. Astor Enterprises was one of the biggest conglomerates in the country, but there was something refreshing about not being recognized. "Just a businessman," he said vaguely. Oriana arched a brow, unconvinced, but didn't push. Instead, she held her hands out toward the fire, sighing. "Well, businessman, I think we're stuck here for a while." Michael exhaled, glancing out the window. The blizzard was relentless. "Yeah," he murmured. "Looks like we are." For the first time in years, Michael Astor had no control over what came next. And strangely, as he looked at the woman sitting across from him, he didn't entirely mind. The fire crackled, casting flickering golden light across the cabin's rustic walls. Oriana stretched her hands toward the warmth, still trying to shake off the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Michael sat across from her, rolling the sleeves of his crisp dress shirt up to his forearms, his movements precise and controlled. Outside, the wind howled against the wooden structure, rattling the windows. The storm showed no signs of slowing, trapping them in an unexpected pocket of isolation. She glanced at him, curiosity bubbling beneath her exhaustion. He was composed, almost unnervingly so, as if he were used to being in control of everything around him. But there was something else, something guarded in the way he carried himself. "You don't seem too bothered by all of this," she observed, pulling the thick throw blanket around her shoulders. Michael leaned back against the wooden chair, his expression unreadable. "Worrying won't change anything. We'll leave when the storm lets us." "Easy for you to say," she muttered. "You look like someone who's used to things going his way." He let out a dry chuckle. "You could say that." A beat of silence stretched between them before she tilted her head. "You're not from around here, are you?" Michael shook his head, running a hand through his dark hair. "New York." "Figures," she mused. "You've got that polished, big city air about you." He arched a brow. "And you?" "Denver," she answered. "Well, for now, I move around a lot." Michael studied her, intrigued. "Why's that?" Oriana hesitated, as if debating how much to say. "I just haven't found the right place to settle," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "Every time I think I have, life has other plans." He considered that. Something about the way she said it made him wonder what she was running from or toward. "You travel for work?" he asked. She gave a small, almost wistful smile. "I used to. I was a photographer, but things changed." Michael picked up on the weight beneath her words but didn't pry. He knew what it was like to keep certain truths guarded. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. After a moment, Oriana exhaled and stood, pacing slightly before glancing toward the small kitchenette tucked into the corner. "Think this place has food?" Michael followed her gaze. "Let's find out." Together, they rummaged through the cabinets, unearthing a few canned goods and a half-empty bag of coffee. "Well, it's not exactly a 5-star meal, but it'll keep us from starving," Oriana said, grabbing a can opener. Michael leaned against the counter, watching as she worked. "You ever been in a situation like this before?" she laughed under her breath. "Stranded in a cabin with a stranger during a blizzard? No, can't say I have." "You're handling it well," he noted. She looked up at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "I've learned to adapt." Michael didn't miss the layer of meaning beneath her words. He understood that sentiment more than he cared to admit. They ate in companionable silence, the storm raging outside. Afterward, Oriana wandered toward the window, her fingers brushing against the frosted pane. "I don't think we'll be getting out of here anytime soon." Michael moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and steady. "Probably not." She turned to face him fully. "So what do we do until then?" He met her gaze, something shifting in his expression. "We wait." And yet, as the hours stretched on, Michael found himself realizing that waiting with Oriana Owens didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something he didn't want to end. The fire had burned low, casting elongated shadows across the wooden walls of the cabin. Hours had passed, though neither of them had kept track. Outside, the storm still raged, a relentless force of nature that refused to loosen its grip on the world beyond the frosted windows. Oriana had settled on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, a half-empty mug of coffee cradled in her hands. Michael sat nearby, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze flickering between the fire and the woman across from him. The air between them had shifted, no longer the wary politeness of two strangers trapped by circumstance, but something quieter, heavier. She exhaled, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "This is probably the longest I've been forced to sit still in a long time." Michael studied her, intrigued. "You don't like staying in one place?" Her lips pressed together for a moment before she answered. "It's not that, it's just. When you keep moving, you don't have to think too hard about what you're leaving behind." His expression darkened slightly. He knew that feeling all too well. She glanced at him, catching the shift in his demeanor. "And you?" she asked. "You strike me as someone who doesn't stop moving either." He leaned back, considering her words. "I don't." Oriana tilted her head, waiting for him to elaborate. Michael's jaw tightened slightly. "When you build something from nothing, slowing down isn't an option. There's always something else that needs to be done, another deal, another risk." Her brow furrowed slightly. "That sounds exhausting." A dry chuckle escaped him. "It is." She watched him for a moment as if seeing through the carefully constructed armor he wore. "Does it ever stop feeling like you have something to prove?" His fingers curled slightly against his knee. No one had ever asked him that, not in a way that mattered. Michael met her gaze, something raw flickering beneath the surface. "Not yet." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Oriana shifted slightly, setting her mug down on the wooden table. "Maybe you should figure out who you are outside of all that." He let out a breath, shaking his head. "Easier said than done." She gave a small, knowing smile. "Most things worth doing are." Michael didn't reply, but her words settled in the back of his mind, unsettling in their accuracy. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and Oriana shivered slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Without thinking, Michael stood, crossing the room to grab another from the small storage chest near the fireplace. He draped it over her without a word. She looked up, surprised by the small gesture. "Thank you." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a beat too long before he turned away. The fire crackled, filling the quiet between them. Oriana stretched her legs out, sighing. "You know, if you'd told me yesterday that I'd be stuck in a cabin with a complete stranger, I would have laughed in your face." Michael let out a low chuckle. "Same." She looked at him then, something unreadable in her expression. "But I don't think I mind." His chest tightened slightly at her words. He didn't either. And that was dangerous. Because Michael Astor didn't do attachments, didn't let people in. His world was built on control, on carefully curated relationships that served a purpose. But Oriana Owens didn't fit into any of that. And yet, sitting here with her, watching the firelight dance across her face, he realized something unsettling. He didn't want to leave this behind. The storm had finally begun to ease, though the wind still whispered against the cabin walls, reluctant to release them just yet. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing softly, casting warmth into the quiet space. Oriana shifted slightly on the couch, her gaze flickering toward the window where the first hints of dawn bled into the sky, pale and hesitant. Michael stood near the fireplace, his expression unreadable as he stirred the remnants of the fire with a poker. His usual precision and control seemed dulled, replaced by something quieter, something unsettled. Neither of them had slept much. The night had stretched long, filled with conversations that peeled back layers neither had expected to reveal. And now, with the storm retreating, reality threatened to intrude. Oriana exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the blanket draped around her shoulders. "It's clearing," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed. Michael glanced toward the window, nodding once. "Looks like it." A silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Oriana hesitated before pushing herself to her feet, feeling the ache of exhaustion settle in her limbs. "I guess that means we can head back soon." Michael's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers curling around the poker before setting it aside. "Yeah." But the word felt heavy, reluctant. She studied him, searching for anything that would make this moment easier to walk away from. But Michael Astor was a man who had built his life on control, and she knew he wouldn't easily reveal what was simmering beneath the surface. Still, something in his stance betrayed him. Oriana took a slow step toward him, her pulse quickening. "Last night." She started, hesitating when his gaze lifted to hers, dark and unreadable. Michael didn't let her finish. In 2 strides, he closed the space between them, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that sent a shiver down her spine. His breath was warm against her skin as he spoke, his voice low, rough around the edges. "I don't want this to end." Her heart slammed against her ribs, the sheer honesty in his words unraveling whatever resistance she might have had left. "But it has to, right?" she whispered, though she didn't truly want an answer. Michael's grip tightened slightly, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "It doesn't." Oriana swallowed, her emotions tangling in a way she hadn't expected. "Michael." "I know we just met," he admitted, his voice raw in a way that made her breath catch. "But I do know one thing: I don't want to go back to my life without you in it." She searched his face, trying to find some trace of hesitation, but there was none, just unwavering certainty. Everything about this should have been impossible. They were strangers thrown together by chance, two people from completely different worlds. And yet, standing here, wrapped in the warmth of a dying fire and the remnants of a storm, none of that seemed to matter. Oriana let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You don't even know what my life looks like outside of this cabin." Michael's lips twitched, the barest hint of something softer breaking through. "Then show me." Her chest tightened. It wasn't a promise made lightly. He wasn't the kind of man who said things he didn't mean. For the first time in a long time, the idea of staying still didn't terrify her. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to run anymore. The first light of morning crept through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale glow over the cabin's interior. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the air carried the lingering scent of wood smoke and something unspoken between them. Michael stood by the window, his hands resting on the rough wooden ledge as he looked out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in white, untouched and silent. He could see the road now, buried but visible, and in the distance, the faint outline of what might have been Oriana's abandoned car. She sat on the couch, fingers curled loosely against the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The weight of what had been said between them the night before lingered, thick in the air. Neither had taken it back, and neither had tried to explain it away as a moment of desperation brought on by the storm. But now, with the world opening up to them again, reality loomed. Michael turned from the window, his gaze settling on her. "We should be able to get out of here soon," he said, his voice even. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Looks like it." A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with something fragile and new. Michael crossed the room, stopping in front of her. "I meant what I said last night." Oriana looked up at him, something flickering in her eyes. "I know." "You said I don't know what your life looks like outside of this place," he continued, his voice steady. "Then show me." Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of the blanket. "Michael, you live in a different world than I do." He crouched down in front of her, resting his hands on the edge of the couch. "Then let's figure out how to make them fit together." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "It's not that simple." His gaze didn't waver. "It doesn't have to be complicated either." Oriana exhaled, her breath shaky. "You don't even know what you're asking." Michael's lips parted, but before he could answer, a distant sound broke the silence, the unmistakable hum of an approaching vehicle. Oriana sat up straighter, glancing toward the window. "That must be the rescue crew." Michael stood, his jaw tightening. The moment was slipping through his fingers and he wasn't sure how to hold on to it. She pushed the blanket aside and rose to her feet. "We should get ready." He watched her for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah." They gathered what little they had used from the cabin, making sure everything was left as they had found it. The distant hum grew louder until headlights cut through the morning haze, bouncing off the snow. Michael stepped outside first, the cold biting through his shirt, but he barely noticed. A heavy-duty truck came into view, the driver rolling down the window. "Got a call about a couple of stranded travelers," the man called out. "You the ones?" Michael nodded. "That's us." Oriana stepped out beside him, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The driver gave them an assessing look before jerking his thumb toward the truck. "We can take you both back to town. Roads are clearing up, but it's slow going." Michael glanced at Oriana. "Ready?" She hesitated for only a breath before nodding. "Yeah." They climbed into the truck, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the cold outside. As the vehicle rumbled forward, Oriana stared out the window, watching the cabin disappear behind them. Michael sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't about to let this end here. The truck rumbled down the snow-packed road, each mile pulling them further from the cabin and closer to reality. Oriana kept her gaze fixed on the frost-covered trees flashing past the window, her mind a tangled mess of emotions. Michael sat beside her, his presence solid and unwavering, but she could sense the tension in him. Neither of them spoke as the vehicle made its slow descent into town, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything unsaid. As the truck pulled into the outskirts of Denver, the driver glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "Where do you two need to go?" Oriana hesitated. She had no clear destination, no real home, just a temporary apartment she barely considered hers. But before she could answer, Michael spoke. "Take us to the Ritz-Carlton." Her head snapped toward him. "Michael, you don't have to," he met her gaze, his expression unreadable yet firm. "I do." She didn't argue. There was no point. He was the kind of man who made decisions without hesitation, and right now he had decided she wasn't going anywhere alone. The truck pulled up in front of the towering hotel, its grand entrance gleaming beneath the morning light. Michael opened the door and stepped out first, offering his hand to her. Oriana hesitated briefly before placing her fingers in his palm, allowing him to help her onto the pavement. The driver gave them a knowing nod before pulling away. Michael led her inside without a word, the warmth of the lobby enveloping them as they stepped across the marble floor. The concierge greeted him by name, not even blinking at their snow-dampened clothes. Within minutes, they were in a suite on one of the highest floors, the panoramic view of the city stretching out before them. Oriana stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking in the sight of Denver blanketed in white. Michael removed his coat, draping it over a chair before turning to her. "Stay here as long as you need." She turned to face him. "Michael, I don't need—" "I know," he interrupted gently, "but I want you to." Her chest tightened. He wasn't just offering her a hotel room. He was offering something far more dangerous: comfort, security, a place she didn't have to run from. She crossed her arms, needing something to anchor herself. "And then what? When the snow melts, we just go back to our separate lives." Michael stepped closer, his gaze locked onto hers. "Is that what you want?" Oriana swallowed hard. "I don't know what I want." He reached out, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "I do." Her breath hitched. "Michael, I don't do things halfway, Oriana," he said, his voice steady, his touch lingering. "I don't meet someone like you and just walk away." She searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity. But could she trust it? Could she trust herself? Her life had been a series of temporary stops, of fleeting moments she never allowed to take root. But Michael Astor wasn't fleeting. He was unshakable, a force that didn't bend to uncertainty. Could she let herself belong to something, to someone, without the fear of losing it? Michael seemed to read the turmoil in her eyes. He took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. "I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for a chance." Oriana exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around his. "Okay." A slow smile spread across his face, relief flickering in his gaze. "Okay." And just like that, the world outside the window didn't seem so overwhelming anymore. Weeks passed, and with them, the walls Oriana had spent years building began to crumble. Michael didn't just integrate himself into her life, he made space for her in his. He flew her to New York, showing her the city through his eyes. He brought her into his world, introducing her to the empire he had built, and yet, he never once made her feel like she had to change to fit into it. She found herself capturing moments again, her camera rediscovering the beauty in stillness. And Michael became the subject of so many of those stolen images. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, the city glittering beneath them, Michael took her hands in his. "I was going to wait," he admitted, his voice low, steady. "Make some grand, elaborate plan." Oriana frowned slightly. "For what?" He pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box. Her breath caught. Michael opened it, revealing a ring that shimmered beneath the city lights. "For this." Her heart pounded against her ribs. "I don't want temporary, Oriana," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want fleeting, I want you every day for as long as you'll have me." Tears pricked at her eyes. "Michael, I love you," he continued, unwavering. "And I know this isn't something you ever planned for, but neither was that snowstorm, and look where it brought us." A laugh escaped her, choked and breathless. Michael smiled, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "Marry me." Oriana looked at him, at the man who had turned her world upside down and somehow made it feel right. She didn't have to run anymore. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to get the word out before he pulled her into his arms, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that sealed everything between them. The wedding was intimate, held in a glass-walled venue overlooking the city where their love had truly begun. Snow fell gently outside, a quiet echo of the night that had changed everything. Oriana looked up at Michael as they swayed to the music, her fingers laced with his. "I never thought I'd be here." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Neither did I." She smiled against his chest, closing her eyes, "but I'm glad I am." Michael tightened his hold on her, his voice a quiet promise against her ear. "So am I." And as the snow fell beyond the glass, the past faded into something distant, something that no longer held her captive. Because she had found something worth staying for. And this time, she wasn't going anywhere.